Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Bullock, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, COVID, resilience, crisis management, anything that's relatable to those topics. Speaking of topics, if there is something you'd like us to talk about on the show or you'd like to be a guest, please feel free. You can reach me, either leave a comment uh, underneath the video here in the comment section, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Bullock on LinkedIn, so you're not going to have problems trying to find me. Anyone who's listened to the Voice America show, I aired an episode on August 6th, 2020 with Dr. Jamie Gruman, and we talked about well-being in crisis. I'd like to welcome back to the show today, Dr. Jamie Gruman. Jamie, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be back. Thanks for having me.
And just in case somebody watching didn't catch the Voice America show, could you take a minute and just tell us about yourself?
Well, I am a professor of organizational behavior at the University of Guelph in the Lang School of Business. And my research and writing focuses largely on two main areas. One is organizational socialization, so how do you get newcomers on board effectively? And the other is organizational well-being and positive organizational psychology.
And Jamie is actually just kind of metaphorically down the street from me here. You know, we're in the same city, Guelph.
Yeah.
And well-being is actually what brought me to reach out to you this time as well. You had a blog or an article posted on psychologytoday.com about a week and a half ago on well-being. And I'm going to let you take over and talk about that in just a minute. The reason why I asked Jamie to come on the show specifically is if you've been watching videos and listening to the Voice America shows recently, you'll find that well-being is cropping up a lot. And obviously that's because of isolation. People, not with coworkers, they're far from family, they're not mingling with friends, kids are home. There's a lot of stress on people right now. And we're all being asked to keep an eye out, on our friends and family and on meetings, and make sure that everyone is okay and mental well-being, is, being addressed. However, the part that's being missed, in my view, is what are we looking for? We don't know what to look for or how to address it properly. We're just being told to look for it, but look for what, and your paper, Dr. Gruman, I thought gave some great insights and information to help a lot of people, which is why I asked you, if we could talk today and you present what it is that you put in this article on Psychology Today.
Sure. So I'll present that to you. First of all, let's dispense with Dr. Gruman. Jamie is fine.
Jamie, yeah.
And thank you. And sure. So let me tell you about this this model that I put together, which I guess does address this concern that you've had. So in fact, let me share my screen because I think it's always easier to make sense of what's being discussed if it's in picture form. So can you see that, Alex?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So this is what I discussed in the Psychology Today blog. And it is based on this little model that I put together in a book chapter that I wrote, I guess, last year, 2020, it was in the Palgrave Handbook of Workplace Wellbeing. And I wrote a chapter where I applied my balance framework. So I have a model of well-being that's called the balance framework, which evolved out of my work my experience with the Canadian Positive Psychology Association. So I'm a founding member of the Canadian Positive Psychology Association. And when I was there, I had, a lot of opportunities to speak and interact with people whose views of what was positive was, in my mind, a little bit lollipops and rainbows. And so, being a psychologist, a scientist, someone who studies well-being and positive psychology is a study of, what makes things worth living. What are the best things in life? Instead of just focusing on depression and anxiety and schizophrenia, Martin Seligman, who was then president of the American Psychological Association at the turn of the century, said, hey, psychologists of the world, let's focus on the good stuff and study that and learn about it. So this isn't, psychologists aren't cheerleaders for positivity. They are scientists who study it. And I'm a scientist who studies it and tries to understand what it is. And so I developed this balanced framework to try to understand positivity and to some extent negativity better and help people understand it. And then, so in this chapter that I was writing, at the start of it, before I got into the balance stuff applied to the workplace, I wanted to give people a model to help them understand just well-being in general and the categories of things that represent well-being. And what I came up with was something I called the movement model of workplace well-being. And then in popular form, I call it the Geyser model, because when I tried drawing it, it looked like a geyser, right? It's water coming out of the ground. And so this is it, the Geyser model. And it suggests that well-being has, or the things that we think of as involving well-being can be broken down into 4 categories. And so if you're interested, as you were saying before, if you want to understand the things to look for in other people, or even just the things to consider within yourself, as reflecting different kinds of well-being, and there are different kinds of it, then this is something that I thought might help people. So, and it's new, so it's a work in progress. So if you have feedback on it, or anyone has feedback on it, I'm happy to hear it. So just run through it quickly. So the first piece to consider is moving towards. So in fact, most of the things that we think of when we think of well-being fit within the moving towards category. And so the moving towards category, that's a category that encompasses things that get you moving, get you actively engaged in life, actively progressing towards goals, engaging with yourself and other people and activities. And so well-being constructs, or positive constructs like hope and optimism, self-efficacy, confidence. Let's look at my notes here actually from the chapter. So elevation, subjective well-being, so feeling that you're satisfied with your life. All of these things involve sort of eliciting sort of mastery motivation and moving you towards the achievement of goals that you find important. And typically when we think of well-being, this is the category we think of. Positive emotions, right? When we talk about being concerned about our colleagues and they're not enjoying well-being and what can we do about it, I think typically what we're looking for is, how happy are they? Are they enjoying positive emotions or positive affect? And so that's that first category. But, and this is the reason I put the model together, it's not the only category of things to consider. So the second category is, move to the other side, the moving against category. So in addition to things that lead us to move towards objectives and goals, part of well-being involves moving against things. And in the book, I discuss the fact that I think not always, but oftentimes this involves moving against situations in the service of social justice. And so if you are at work and you need to bend a rule in order to help a distressed client, well, you're moving against the status quo. If you speak up at work because you think that the policies and procedures that you have in place don't serve the interests of women and minorities, and you speak up and you voice some concern about that, well, you're moving against the status quo. If you're, I discussed this example in the article in the Psych Today post. If you're drunk and you pour your last bottle of vodka down the drain, you're moving against the status quo and the pride that you feel in engaging in all of these sorts of activities. That pride is a form of well-being. But notice this is different from moving towards. You're not hopeful and optimistic in a sense. You're not engaged in riding the rapids down the existing stream, river. You're moving against the existing stream and river. You're doing something different from the status quo. And so this is a form of well-being, or there can be well-being that is different from the moving towards type. And I think part of the reason I had this idea came from my last book called Boost, which was about how to recover effectively in our leisure time. I think that's what we talked about
Yeah, we
in our
did.
last
We talked
discussion,
about
right?
that on the Voice America show.
So in that book, I talk about psychological detachment. And so what's really important when you're away from work is to not, during regular times, not just physically leave the office, but mentally leave the office. You have to detach from everyday activities. And so I think that's what got me thinking about the fact that part of what's involved in well-being is moving away from things sometimes, not moving always towards them. So that's that second category. And then the third category is moving with. So moving with it involves forms of well-being in which there is this sense of engagement and flow with the situation. So some examples of this would be flow, Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow, harmony, engagement, mindfulness, finding meaning in situations, gratitude, awe. All of these sorts of psychological constructs are things, experiences in which there's a fluidity of the experience. You're there and you are engaged, and instead of feeling like you're moving towards something, you feel like you've arrived, like you're there. And it's a qualitatively different type of experience. And I thought we needed another category to capture these sorts of things. So that's moving with. And then the final category is not moving. So in that category, we have constructs like peace of mind, job satisfaction would fit here, equanimity, calm, where there's a lack of mental agitation. And these are, I would say, relatively less investigated in management and in psychology. And so this is the model. This is what I put together to try to give people a sense of the sorts of things to consider when they think about what well-being is and the different categories of well-being that exist. And as I said, it's a work in progress. It's not the final word on the topic, but for someone who maybe doesn't have any experience with the topic of well-being, I was hoping that this would be a way to maybe expand their ideas of what well-being is beyond just the sense of just feeling good and enjoying positive emotions, because it's much broader than that. So I'll stop my share here.
And as I said, that's what a lot of people just look for right now. People in my industry, we're being told, we have to keep our eyes open for, our colleagues' well-being. Are they happy? And they always just focus on that one area. And when I read your article, it's like, no, there are others we need to consider here.
Yeah.
Which is why I wanted you to come on and talk about it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And let me elaborate on this a little bit also. I should clarify, I'm an organizational psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I don't do therapy. What positive psychology is about is helping people who, are sort of at an average level of functioning to enhance their functioning, not take people who are suffering and help them overcome that. That's for clinical psychologists. I don't do that. And if someone is, of course, at a level where they're suffering so much that it's interfering with their daily functioning, then they need professional help from someone who focuses on that. That's not me. I'm a more casual, I guess, a more casual approach to this topic. But what you just raised is an important issue. And as I was mentioning to you, we were speaking before we got on the call. Let me share my screen again. I teach a course on workplace well-being at the university. It's a new course. And I put together some slides to try to explain to my students just a few weeks ago the way to think about well-being in a healthy way. And let me share with you some of these thoughts. So the first thing to consider is that in positive psychology, we often think of, when we consider, what does it mean to be positive? Sometimes we think of it in sort of this way, that there's sort of neutral, average functioning. And then, of course, there's negative functioning. So if you're stressed or anxious, depressed, can't get out of bed, that's, of course, negative functioning. And then there's positive functioning. So the implication of making this distinction is that well-being and positivity is more than just the absence of negativity, right? The absence of negativity brings you to neutrality, but then there's more. You can enhance your life. You can flourish, you can thrive, which is more than just overcoming negativity. And so with this distinction in mind, I'm going to actually argue that this may not be always the best way to think about things. But for now, let's start with this. And to put in context my thoughts, again, I could be wrong on this, but these are my current thoughts about this topic. So this is what I think about workplace well-being and well-being in general these days. So clearly, we don't want to be, hovering in the negative range all the time. And this is what I was saying before. If someone is so upset, so anxious, so depressed that they just can't function for a prolonged period, then they need professional help, right? That is clearly not the way we're designed to live. This is, I should say, a normal way to live when very traumatic and difficult things happen. If your spouse dies, you may be like this for a while. Now, if it is prolonged, if it lasts for a year or more, maybe who knows? I'm not saying it's necessarily the case, but maybe you might want to speak with somebody. But this is certainly something that we don't want, and I think we can easily agree on this. What some people think about when they think about positivity is that this is the way we should be living. That as if we are smart and informed about how to live properly, then every day we wake up and we jump out of bed and everything is wonderful. And this, I think, is frankly naive. Unless you are, enlightened, you practice Buddhism and you just, overcome worldly desires, or you're a saint, and you can just, you're living outside of regular life. Maybe this is reasonable, but for most people, I think this is not reasonable. This is sort of the lollipops and rainbows approach that I was talking about before. And so what's more reasonable is something like this, where you've got some ups, you've got some downs. Notice what I've done in this graph is you'll see that the line is slightly above the neutral line, because there's a lot of research demonstrating that the natural state of human beings is to be ever so slightly positive. We have sort of an optimistic bias. We all tend to think, in general, that we're better drivers than other people. We tend to think we're going to be healthier over the course of our lives than other people. And this optimistic bias that is very adaptive, because if you think of the course of evolution, our ancestors who didn't have this slight positivity bias weren't motivated to go try to find an antelope to eat. And so they just stayed in their cave and didn't survive. Whereas those who were slightly more, perhaps naively optimistic, went out nonetheless, found the antelope and survived. And so we are the beneficiaries of this inherited tendency to think ever so slightly in a positive way. And so if we try to promote workplace wellness, I think this is perhaps a way to think about what we're shooting for, where we perhaps raise the baseline ever so slightly. Notice it's not particularly high, that baseline, right? It's still just a little bit higher. And because of that, we have some higher peaks. We still have some lows. The idea of enjoying workplace well-being does not mean that we never feel bad. It doesn't mean that we never feel scared or anxious. We will, but we don't want to be there all the time. So this, I think, is a way to think about the positive and the negative. But during a global pandemic, it might be more realistic to think about this. The fact that, this is a crazy time. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in a month or a year? There are so many people who are unemployed right now and don't know how they're going to pay the rent, or if they're going to pay the rent, or have had to move in with other people because they're going to share the load, which can be, nobody would want to have to do that, but to have the resource to be able to do that, right? One of the things that can help people feel better is to do sort of an audit of their resources. And so when things get difficult, who can you rely on? What other resources are there? Economic resources, from the government. That Canada is so generous relative to the rest of the planet. So we're lucky in a sense to be here. It's not perfect by any means, but when things are tough, it's healthy to recognize that they're tough. The idea that and I think this happens very often these days, the idea that everyone should still be operating at full capacity, just as productive as they always were, with a smile on their face, very engaged and gung-ho, is insensitive. It's not realistic to think that that's how people should be. And so I think it can be comforting to recognize that in difficult times, you're going to not be at your best. If we do focus on emotions, one way to think about why we have them is through a functional lens. So emotions serve a purpose, and negative emotions like anxiety and fear signal to us that something is wrong. Well, you know what? Something is wrong right now. And so to feel anxious and scared is normal. Now, you don't want to be along the bottom of that chart all day and every week. That would be dysfunctional. And you want to be able to try to find some positivity among the negativity, and have at least some of these blips where you're above the neutral line, even maybe experiencing some positivity. But employers that, I've seen two types of employers over the course of the pandemic. There are those who say, we get it, things are tough. There was on social media some months ago, someone had posted something from, it was a Government of Canada department that said, look, we get it, things are difficult right now. Take care of yourself. We don't expect you to be as productive as usual, and that's okay. We understand. They were sympathetic. And that is, I think, the way it should be. And then there are other organizations that say, no, we don't care. You're paid to get the work done. Get the work done at the same level of performance. And I think
It's interesting you just said that, because I did interview somebody the other day, and they said they've come across employers who have said, they can't wait to get their employees back into the office so they can make sure they're doing their job right again. And I just kind of went, what? That's micromanaging. Why would you want to do that to someone? You're why? I don't get that.
Yeah, I think I get it. I think, people go through business school and they learn a lot of finance and economics and operations, and they end up treating people like resources, human resources. But people aren't resources. People are people, and they should be treated like people, and they should be treated humanely. And when we face difficult circumstances, they should be given a break and helped. And so I think this is a more reasonable way to think about well-being. It's tough, and you should accept that it's tough, acknowledge that it's tough, and recognize that if you feel that it's tough, then that's normal, right? If you didn't think things were tough, if you didn't feel any stress about your paying the rent and whether you're going to have your job and just the state of the world, then I would say something is wrong with you. Because if you're feeling the anxiety and the stress, then your emotions are working the way they're supposed to work, because things are not normal and operating the way we would like them to operate. Mm-hmm. Now, this whole discussion here, I've been making this distinction between positive and negative, but I do want to highlight something else that I think is important to understand. I mentioned that I developed the Geyser model to operate in conjunction with this balance framework that I developed. And that was meant, the balance framework was meant to help us understand what is positive and how should we understand it. And this distinction between positive and negative is, I think, can be misleading. So the fact that, as I said earlier, positive is not simply the absence of negative, that's a good thing to understand. But the positive and negative are more closely related than we often think they are. And I think this is an important thing to understand also. And here's some other graphic that I put together to help drive home this point. The balance framework that I developed underscores the fact that sort of the yin and yang thing. Within every black, there's a little white, and within every white, there's a little black. Every positive issue has some potential negative to it, and every negative issue has some potential positive to it. So, you can be optimistic. That's a positive thing. But if you're too optimistic, then maybe you gamble away your mortgage payments. or you don't bother going to the doctor when you find that lump on your body. So even positive things like optimism, honesty, can have negative sides to them. And so this is something I've been arguing for quite a while. And then it didn't feel right to me. There was something missing. This idea that, would suggest that, well, who could say what's right and wrong? Everything is positive or negative, or there's both in every situation, everything that you experience, then, who's to say what's better or worse? And so what I came up with, and this is just recently, is this. So yes, everything is positive and negative, but the relative proportion is different. So some things like having a baby will be more positive than negative, but anyone who's had a baby knows it's not all positive. You don't sleep for a long time. It's very stressful. And so, the yellow bar here is leaning more towards the left-hand side to indicate that the positive and the negative is not equally balanced. There can be more positive or negative. Similarly, sometimes things are more negative than they are positive. So, your dog dies. That's not a positive thing. It's a negative thing. You're going to be very sad. But if they had been sick for a while and they were suffering and they're not suffering anymore, then there's a little bit of positivity there too. So the relative proportion. So it is the case that every positive has some negative and every negative has some positive, but it doesn't make everything equal, because the relative proportion can change. Now, something to consider about our current circumstance is, if we consider that everything has some positive and negative in it, can it be that there's a silver lining around the negative, that the pandemic could potentially, and other negative things, could in fact make the positive more salient to us? A couple of psychologists, King and Pennebecker, back in 1998, wrote, this is a quote from one of their papers: "It may be in difficult times that the goods of life truly come to the fore." And I was explaining to my students how, I in our basement, it's just big enough that we can have little mini hockey nets and little mini sticks, and I can play hockey with my kids. And these days, in the face of all of this stress and anxiety, I feel myself laughing more and smiling more. I took it for granted before. I didn't even think about it. It just was an everyday occurrence. But these days, it's more precious to me. And this is what I mean by, in difficult times, the goods of life may present themselves even more. And so how do we think about this? Well, in one sense, when there's more negative, perhaps there's more positive also. The more negativity you experience, correspondingly, the more positivity you experience. Or perhaps the deeper the negative goes, the higher the positive goes. People after 9/11 talked about how they reprioritized their lives, and they appreciated the love for their families more than they had previously. This is an example of this, that in the face of the negative, the positive becomes more salient to us. And so I present this to highlight the fact that this distinction that I showed you before between neutral, negative, and positive suggested that positive and negative are different from each other. And I think they're not quite as different as these slides demonstrate. And that's why I wanted to show these, because this is, I think, a more accurate way to think about well-being. And it also highlights that when our employees are not at their best today, it may be the case that, we can ask them, well, what's more precious to you now as a result of these experiences? You just go for a walk. Don't go with anybody else, stay away from people, but just being outside and watching the sunset is just maybe even nicer now than it was before. And so we see how the positive and the negative are intertwined. We need a balanced view of understanding this stuff.
I just love what you said, and I really hope. Well, first thing before I forget is, when it comes to well-being, this also applies to management and leadership, right? It's not just if you have a hierarchical title, well-being doesn't apply to you. It does.
Oh, no.
We're all in the same boat, right?
Well, and of course, we're in the same boat. I mean, no matter what position you are, you're still human. And in fact, when the higher you are in the organization, the more people watch you on stage. And so you have more of an impact on people than people lower in the hierarchy. And so it becomes even more important for you to be a role model, in addition to being someone who supports people and providing them with resources, providing them with formal resources in the organization, like perhaps an EAP, but also just allowing them to get things off their chest, setting up groups so people can talk with each other. I did some work not long ago with an organization that was dealing with this issue, trying to understand how to maintain some well-being during the pandemic. And the main solution they had come up with across the various branches was social gatherings and finding ways for people to connect. I was just a couple of weeks ago, for the first time, I was playing a strategy game online with a colleague of mine. And it was great because, you have these Zoom calls and you have to be so focused. I mean, at this point, it's an old hat to talk about Zoom fatigue. Well, if you're playing a game or you have some sort of activity you can engage in where people are thinking, and so it's okay for there to be some silence, right? Typically on a conference call, you can't have some silence. It's like on the radio, it's a mistake. You can't let that happen. But we're social creatures. And one of the most strongest correlates of well-being is our social connections. And of course, those to such a great extent is what has been compromised during this pandemic. And so if you can find ways at work to let people connect, and that goes a very long way towards helping people mitigate their stress. And, if you can figure out how to get people to laugh, how can you get them to laugh? What can you do to get people? You can't be stressed and laugh at the same time. So bring some joviality into the workplace and lighten up and recognize what's important.
That's missing in the workplace at the best of times, really, because we're always so stressed. There's always a deadline, a deliverable, something that has to be done. And right now it's, to your point, I think it's needed even more.
They're inhuman. There are people who, this is a bigger issue in Europe than it is in North America, but there are people who write about the inhumanity of the modern corporation. It's a dehumanized environment. And so much of the work that I do is trying to rehumanize work environments, help bring back the humanity to a dehumanized environment.
Well, and on that, that's the reason why I wanted you to come on and talk about, the Geyser model that you have here, because I think people really need to have a better understanding of well-being, what it is, rather than it being a buzzword or lip service. People really need to understand it. And I knew when I read your article, I had a better understanding, like, this is a lot more than what even I thought it was. So I'm really glad and happy that you came in and agreed to chat about this.
Thank you. I'm really glad to hear that, because the whole reason I put it together was in the hopes that people would find it valuable. So at least I know one person did. So that's great. Thanks.
Well, I'm going to make sure that other people pay attention to this too, because I think they really need to pay attention, because this is going to be a big thing. We're not out of the woods yet. We've got quite a ways to go, I think. And, as you put it, the world right now is not, what was it, bunnies and rainbows?
Lollipops and
rainbows.
You can use whatever you want. Unicorns, doesn't matter.
Yeah. So I really thank you for your time and your expertise in sharing this with us. And I really hope a lot of people pay attention, because I'm going to really push this and make sure that they do. There's too many people right now that, and some I know, that aren't feeling their best at the moment.
Well, thank you for having me. And I hope, like, if others find it valuable like you did, let me know, email me and let me know. It's just why I do this.
Yes. And you have a website, I noticed on the slides, jamiegruman.com.
Sure. Yep.
And that's JAMIE Gruman.
Right.
Yeah. Just to make sure I get the spelling right. So thank you once again. I really appreciate it. I know we'll meet up eventually here, because we're not that far apart.
Right. Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. And to everybody watching, stay prepared, everyone. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects. You can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.